So I think that reports of a major Russian offensive have been exaggerated. We saw last September when Russia attempted a partial mobilization, 500,000 Russian military-age males left the country rather than be mobilized. And the Ministry of Defense was not prepared to handle the mobilization. We saw that the Russian soldiers did not receive proper equipment, training, accommodation. It was a disaster. And I don't think that the Ministry of Defense in Russia has fixed all of these problems. And so for sure they are getting more troops in, but I don't see any evidence that they are better trained, better prepared. And so what they do have, the Russian military leadership continues to push these untrained or poorly trained soldiers into the meat grinder around Bakhmut and places like this. So it's hard to tell if there really is a new offensive or not, or if they're going to delay it because they're not ready. But I am skeptical that we're going to see anything more significant than just an increase in the number of mass infantry attacks. Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014. They occupied Crimea, they occupied parts of Donbass. And so I think that maybe if people hoped that Russia would not expand this, that they would not do this special military operation. I think even inside Ukraine, the government could have been doing more preparation for ammunition, for example, more air defense, all the weapons that they need now. We lost 7 or 8 years when these things could have been prepared. But regardless, we are where we are today. For me, the biggest surprise was, number one, how poorly the Russian forces performed, how weak Russian logistics are, how strong Ukrainian civilian resistance has been. I knew the Ukrainian soldiers would do well, but I didn't anticipate how strong Ukrainian people would be. The overall amount of ammunition being expended has beyond anything I ever imagined. Certainly in 20 years of Iraq and Afghanistan, we never came close to this much ammunition being used. So that has been something. But I've also been reminded of the importance of young leaders at the company, platoon level, battalion level, that are skilled and able to make decisions at the lower level. This is something that Ukraine has done very well. And also reminded of the importance of having sergeants at the tactical level. Again, this is something that the Russians do not have, but which Ukraine has developed very quickly. Ukrainian soldiers are so fast, so quick at learning to use new technologies. And they impressed me back in 2015 and 16 when I first started seeing them in Yavoriv at the training area. And that's why I'm so confident that they can learn to use any new system that they receive from the West much quicker than people would expect. This is what has evolved over time, because we realize that war, the conditions of uncertainty dominate. There's so much uncertainty out there, so much fog and friction that it's impossible to know exactly what's going to happen everywhere. And so we have learned over the last couple of centuries that to have a decentralized command and control where decision making can be pushed down to the lower level so that leaders can make decisions on their own as long as it accomplishes the higher objective. Whereas the Russian system, everything is centralized. Decisions are made at the top and then pushed down. And that's why you see such huge casualties by Russian forces, because they just push forward as they were told, regardless of the conditions on the ground. And so that means that requires a system of trust where junior leaders are trusted to make decisions that would enable them to exploit opportunity, because they will see on the ground what's actually happening better than somebody back in the headquarters. So after the end of the Cold War, most nations in Europe began to disarm, because there was this mistaken belief that somehow this was it. We didn't have to worry about war with Russia anymore. There was no Soviet Union. We had hoped that Russia was going to be a partner. I can remember there were Russian soldiers with us in Bosnia. during the NATO IFOR mission in 1995 to 97. And so 96 to 97. You know, the U.S. Army in Europe used to have almost 300,000 people. Most of that was sent home. Our tanks came home. We thought it was not going to be necessary. And then, of course, we all were focused on Iraq and Afghanistan. It was a different kind of conflict. And so most European countries reduced dramatically their number of tanks, artillery. They did not manufacture ammunition at the same rate or level anymore. So this was a terrible miscalculation. So we don't have as much as we used to in the European armies. That's just a fact. We disarmed too much. We were naive. But you know, our taxpayers don't want to, if they don't see the threat, and if the civilian leadership does not have the courage or the ability to explain that you have to have strong defense to prevent a threat instead of reacting to the threat, it's hard to do, and people want to see money spent on other things. This was a political failure as well as a strategic failure, why we have such reduced amounts of ammunition, tanks, and so on. Now, there are thousands of Leopards in Europe. There still are thousands of American Abrams tanks in other places. So there's capability out there, but it's not consolidated in one place. Not all of it is modernized. And then, of course, there's political decisions, as you and your listeners know very well, because of export agreements. You know, one nation like Switzerland can block, or Germany can block other nations who want to provide things. So that's why we are where we are. In order to modernize, to transition from T-72, for example, to a Leopard or Abrams or some other more modern tank, it's very expensive. Or to transition from a BMP or BTR, a Western infantry fighting vehicle, Rosomak or Bradley, for example, it's very expensive. And so if nations don't see a major threat, they're reluctant to go through that transition. But I would say that most countries for this past year were already underway doing that. Romania was already doing that. Poland was already doing that. I think Baltic countries were already doing that. So that's why you have a mix of Warsaw Pact type equipment as well as Western equipment. I think people have been reawakened to the importance of deterrence, of what's required for deterrence, that you have to invest in defense if you want to prevent conflict. All of Russia's aggression happened after we disarmed. So this is a lesson seems like we have to learn it over and over and over again. So I think most nations will probably are already beginning to rearm, even Germany, in recognition of this. We'll see how long it lasts, but it will require people to have their eyes open, to not be naive. And it will require our political leaders to explain why you have to invest in defense, even if the threat is not quite so obvious.